Well, welcome everyone. I'm Sarah Anderson. I work here at the Institute for Policy Studies, and I'm really happy to be moderating this discussion about the CEO to worker pay gaps. We thought it was a really good time to organize a discussion like this because we're feeling like right now in the country, inequality is just absolutely the buzzword of the day, but there's a real challenge in trying to make sure that that term is remains meaningful. You know, we've got Republicans out there taking advantage of all the interest in inequality to, one more chance to bash Obamacare and to push for school vouchers. You have President Obama saying a lot of nice lines about inequality, the causes, how it affects our society, but when it comes to solutions, he's mostly focused on raising the minimum wage. And of course, we're very excited also about the momentum behind minimum wage increases here, but we also think if we're really going to tackle extreme inequality, we need to deal with the top end of the inequality problem as well, and a big part of that problem is excessive executive pay. So here at the Institute for Policy Studies, we've been working for about 20 years now to try to narrow the CEO to worker pay divide. We have an annual report called Executive Excess. We have a great newsletter that my colleague Sam Pizzigatti does called Too Much. You can sign up for it on the sheet that's going around. And we've also, and so we were really thrilled almost 4 years ago now when this provision slipped through the Dodd-Frank legislation requiring companies to finally report the gap between what their CEOs and their median workers make. So we were very excited. We were even more excited when we saw how upset the corporate lobby groups were about this, because even though it's a disclosure requirement, doesn't require them to make any changes on executive pay, they seem to really freak out about this. And I think it helped us fully appreciate what a big step this was and how it could lead to much bolder reforms linking CEO to worker pay ratios to tax policy, to procurement policy, and so forth. But then, after Dodd-Frank went into effect, we thought we could move on to building on these accomplishments for some broader reforms. And instead, many of us have spent the past nearly 4 years now just trying to make sure that the executive pay provisions in Dodd-Frank were actually implemented. And, you know, after President Obama signed that new law, the media and much of the public attention really moved on. But there's a great core of groups here in Washington that's really kept up the drumbeat to try to get these implemented, and especially through Americans for Financial Reform, which is the big coalition that came together to push for Dodd-Frank. There's a task force called the Executive Compensation Task Force. It's run by Bart Naylor, who's here from Public Citizen. It includes Change to Win, that's also represented here, and many others that have really kept the drumbeat going to get these implemented. And one of the most committed drumbeaters on this has been Vanita Anand of the AFL-CIO, who's really been a champion in pushing this forward. So she's going to tell us a lot about where things stand on that issue and how we can continue to build on that. And then more recently, we met Peter McLeod from Canada, who is with this WageMark initiative that you'll be hearing about. And I just met him for the first time last night, and it felt like we have known him forever because he really speaks the same language that we do on these issues. But the fun thing is that he's come at it from a very different point of view and a very different strategy than we have thought about in this country to try to get companies certified that have narrow wage gaps. So we thought it would be a really fun moment to see what we could be learning from each other and just taking advantage of all the attention on inequality to keep moving this ahead. So I think maybe we'll start out with Vanita and then go to Peter, and then we'll have a nice discussion and brainstorming.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Sarah and Sam and everybody else here at IPS for inviting me to this event today, and also for setting the backdrop on this. This provision in Dodd-Frank, Section 953B, as we, some of us who are sort of focused on this so closely call it, was actually finally proposed by the SEC on September 18th last year. The law went into effect in July of 2010, so this was more than 3 years later, and there had been a great deal of opposition. So we were very pleased when the SEC did propose it, and the proposal was everything we would like to see. The proposal has received more than 147,000 comment letters, and the vast majority of them strongly support disclosure of the ratio. Behind the scenes, there have been meetings between the business groups and lobbyists, with the commissioners, with members of the Division of Corporation Finance, and they've continued to comment. And organizations such as the American Benefits Council have sent in supplementary comment letters as lately as last month. So I'll talk a little bit about executive compensation and give you a little backdrop. Executive compensation in this country was not disclosed or really studied until the Securities Exchange Act of 1934, which required public companies to start disclosing executive compensation. In the early part of the 20th century, now we're talking before the Depression, the Golden Age, the 20s, the Roaring 20s, despite the wide gap between the salaries of corporate executives and the average worker, media coverage did not seem to focus on the injustice, rather expressed awe at those who had achieved success. A 1911 report on U.S. Steel for shareholders and investors by Dow Jones and Company estimated that the average yearly wage per U.S. Steel employee in 1903 was $720.61. Assuming that the CEO Albert Gary's salary to be $100,000 in 1903, remember we didn't know how much they made for sure. It was a gap of 138.8 times the yearly earnings of the average employee. Yet such comparisons were uncommon, non-existent, were not really talked about in the national media. Then we move forward. On 29th May 1936, a U.S. Senate resolution directed the Federal Trade Commission, or the FTC, to study executive compensation. And this culminated in the report of the FTC on compensation of officers and directors of certain corporations in 1934. So 1934 was the year it was studied. And to examine the ideas of executives, the government, lawmakers, and the general population about the practice of awarding large salaries and bonuses to executives. Carola Friedman, I'm not sure how you pronounce it, an economist at MIT, said in a 2009 article that revelations regarding executive pay first occurred during World War I, when railroad corporations became managed by the federal government and the exorbitant salaries of railroad officers were exposed for the first time. So we're starting to see a buzz building around the early 20th century. The winter of 1921 brought the New York Times headlines, "New York Reserve Bank salaries attacked. Denies 100,000 salary." So around that time, there's a lot of this going on. Then in a series of pieces published between 1932 and 34, the New York Times both publicized and castigated executive compensation schemes in articles, calling for the lowering of high salaries, reorganization of corporate structure, government inquiry into compensation practices, and even taxes on executive pay. So while the public may have been in the dark about, or at least content to turn a blind eye towards executive compensation before the Great Depression, the sharp contrast between the excesses of corporate officers and the hardships suffered by most Americans spurred outrage, ultimately leading to government investigation and intervention. Now, the whole idea of pay caps, you might be surprised, but it was the industrialist J. Pierpont Morgan, the founder of J.P. Morgan, who once said that no one at the top of the company should earn more than 20 times those at the bottom. This is long before Peter Drucker. Of course, Peter Drucker is well known as the management guru who espoused the notion of a pay ratio of 25-1 or 20-1. He went back and forth. First, it was 25-1 in 1977, then in 1984, 20-1. And he said you widen the gap beyond that, and it makes it difficult to foster the kind of teamwork that most businesses require to succeed. The idea of a mandatory pay ratio disclosure of the CEO to worker pay was first suggested by James Cotton. He worked at IBM. He was a securities attorney, and in fact, he was responsible for drafting the company's proxy. After he retired, he taught at the University Law School in Texas, and in a 1997 paper, he said that for an extraordinarily large salary to appear to be both fair and acceptable to shareholders and the public, compensation must be more clearly related to the actual responsibility the executive has and the quality of the executive's actual contribution to the business, and it should be judged against what others are paid for like work and like performance in the same or similar industry. And he believed that the disclosure of the CEO to worker pay ratio would have a significant impact by either lowering the excessive executive pay or by raising the average compensation of employees and managers. Now, I understand that a distant relative of his worked in Senator Robert Menendez's office. It's not clear if that's how Senator Menendez was inspired to include the provision in the Dodd-Frank legislation. That person is no longer in the office, and it's been difficult to track that down, but that's how we believe that happened. So looking at the historical ratios, because we don't have, even today, and we didn't have certainly going back, we have been using estimates of the worker pay based on the Bureau of Labor Statistics averages for workers. In recent decades, the ratio of the CEO to the typical worker pay has grown from 42 times in 1980 to an all-time high of 525 in 2000 before the internet bubble burst. It dipped down slightly during the recession, the Great Recession that we're all familiar with, and then began climbing up. And according to the AFL-CIO's Executive Pay Watch, the ratio stood at 354 times average worker pay in 2012, and I'm guessing it'll have risen for 2013. So over the years, some companies have actually experimented with disclosing some variation of pay caps or a ratio. In 1984, after consulting with Drucker, the furniture maker Herman Miller, which was then a Fortune 500 company, agreed that its CEO's pay would be restricted to 20 times the average of all of its employees. The former CEO, Dick Rook, wrote recalled in a book that the subtle part of this limit was a message to the CEO. If you want to get more pay, you need to do it by raising the average pay of everyone at the company. However, in 1997, Herman Miller ditched the Drucker model. It's now privately owned. In its early days, Ben & Jerry's homemade ice cream also had a very populist notion of holding its CEO's pay to about 7 times that of the average for its workers. In more recent times, a financial institution called MBIA, which is one of those companies that has very few people, about 150, they're all well paid, disclosed the average and median salary for all its employees, allowing investors to calculate the ratio between the CEO to median worker pay. In 2010, the last year for which it disclosed the gap, the CEO's salary and bonus was 14 times that of the median wages. Then the company hired one of those very highly paid compensation consultants who I hate with a vengeance, and the company stopped disclosing this information.
Oh, dear.
A company called El Paso Corporation, which no longer exists as a separate entity. It was bought out by Kinder Morgan. Did not disclose the numbers for median and average pay, but said in its proxies before it went private that it was committed to internal pay equity, and a compensation committee monitors on an annual basis the relationship between the compensation of our named executive officers and the compensation of our non-managerial employees. Whole Foods, as many of you know, caps its CEO salary, not every element, so not total compensation, but the salary at 19 times that of the average worker. The Bank of South Carolina, which is a community bank, discloses the CEO to median worker pay ratio. It's about 4 or 5 times. Northwestern Corporation, utility in Montana, sets the CEO salary and incentive pay at 19 times that of the median worker. Why is this ratio important to us at the AFL-CIO? Why is it important to investors? So various researchers have studied the impact of steep pay gaps between the CEO and the typical worker on productivity, morale, employee turnover, and ultimately the CEO's bottom line. And the conclusion is that this ratio matters because high pay ratios can hurt employee morale and productivity. Employees of publicly traded companies all already know how much the CEO makes relative to their own pay. What's not disclosed is the gap. Academic studies have shown that large pay disparities within a company can hurt teamwork, loyalty, motivation. There's also a sense that the ratio will help moderate the overall level of CEO pay growth. In recent times, there was an article that said that it would shame corporations, and all the business groups jumped on that, saying this ratio is nothing more than a political ploy. It's meant to shame corporations. So shame became the key word here. Over the past 2 decades, average CEO pay at large U.S. corporations increased at an annually compounded rate of 6%, from $3.8 million in 1992 to $12.3 million in 2012. We noted this in our most recent comment letter to the SEC on the proposal. In comparison, average worker pay increased only 3% annually over the same period. Had CEO pay grown at the same rate as average worker pay during this period, the average large company would have paid its CEO $5 million less in 2012. Of course, if worker pay had increased at the same rate as CEO pay, there would be some much happier workers. So the pay ratio disclosure will also help investors evaluate CEO pay levels when voting on executive compensation matters at annual meetings, such as, say, on pay resolutions. And at present, the Lake woebegone trend or effect is what dictates CEO pay. CEO pay levels are set based on a peer group analysis of what other CEOs are being paid. And over time, this use of a peer group leads to a ratcheting up of CEO pay levels, because even if a CEO hasn't done well and the performance has been poor, but the median has gone up, that's any CEO in that group will get more money. So the pay ratio disclosure gives investors an alternative metric to assess the reasonableness of CEO pay within each particular company. And we believe this will encourage consideration of internal compensation practices rather than relying on peer group analysis alone. So ultimately, poor morale, poor productivity, high turnover can reduce a company's performance. And so as an investor, we are worried about that because the bottom line suffers. Charles O'Reilly, who teaches at Stanford Business School and is director of their Center for Leadership Development and Research, has studied huge salary imbalances between the CEO and employees And he said it can send bad vibes through an organization, and I quote directly. So he says, he also discovered that inequity cascades down the senior management from the CEO. In other words, if the CEO is overpaid, the executives under him will also tend to be overpaid, magnifying the cost to shareholders. For example, in a case where the CEO was overpaid 64% compared to the norm, executives one step below were overpaid by 26%. So the ratio will help put a company's compensation practices for its CEO in perspective. Investors will be able to observe how the ratio changes over time or to compare companies in an industry. And this can be very important information for making investment decisions. So looking ahead, we note that the pay ratio disclosure will become more common by foreign companies which are not subject to SEC disclosure requirements, because India, for example, recently enacted a pay ratio disclosure requirement similar to 953B in its Companies Act. And voluntary disclosure of the pay ratio data will also become more frequent thanks to the efforts of the Global Reporting Initiative, or GRI, which in 2013 approved new standards for sustainability reports that urge companies to voluntarily disclose the ratio of the CEO to median worker pay. My colleague Rob McGarrah here is on the board of GRI, so if you're interested afterwards, you can talk to him more about that. And in the context of the minimum wage discussions taking place in the country, it's important to recognize that the disclosure of the ratio will put pressure on companies to raise wages of the median worker. We all have probably heard Gap just announced will increase its minimum hourly wages to $9 an hour this year and $10 an hour next year. There's pressure on Walmart and other large companies to do the same. And one compensation consultant I spoke to recently at a conference said to me in a private conversation that what this ratio is doing is for the first time making boards of directors aware of who the median employee is. It's putting a name and a face on that median employee, and they're beginning to ask questions about why this employee is earning what he or she is earning and whether it should be more or what it's been historically. So there is discussion starting. I will skip the opposition for a minute and tell you next steps. So what you can do is a couple of things. Keep up the pressure on lawmakers to keep up the pressure on regulators. We worry, I'm a worrier and I always worry about this, about the proposal, which was a very strong proposal, being watered down. Keep writing. I mean, if the American Benefits Council and all the corporate groups can send in supplemental comments, it's clear the SEC is accepting more comments, so don't go by the deadline. The AFR is going to organize meetings with the SEC commissioners, and I encourage other organizations, other groups to do the same. And most importantly, keep this issue in the press. So whenever you talk to a reporter, mention this issue and how important it is. SEC Chairman Mary Jo White recently announced that the SEC will begin studying disclosure. And I know that business groups and compensation consultants for the past year and a half have been pressuring the SEC to reduce existing disclosure of pay elements, such as the changes in the value of the pension and the stock option grant aid value, under the guise of these being irrelevant to pay for performance pay. So it's very important to comment to the SEC. It's very important to bring up these issues with lawmakers. And we also need to support the Reed-Blumenthal bill, which Bart Naylor, Sarah, and several other people in this room have been working on, that would remove the loophole, the performance loophole, for the deductibility of executive compensation exceeding $1 million. We also can help keep executive pay at the forefront by pushing the SEC to issue regulations and other pending provisions of Dodd-Frank, namely Section 956, which is the relationship of the riskiness of incentive compensation at financial institutions, and also clawbacks. And it's very encouraging to hear that the new Federal Reserve Chair, Janet Yellen, does believe that executive pay is an issue that needs to be studied. Her comments were quashed back in 2008, but now that she's the chair, we hope that she can comment and push for stronger regulation. I'll just end it there.
Thanks so much, Vanita. As she's made clear, the battle is not yet quite over on CEO to worker pay disclosure here in the U.S., but we have come a long way, and we appreciate all of her continued worrying and driving us to do more. But it's also, I think, a good moment, why don't you move it over to him, that for us to be starting to think about some new strategies and some new tactics. And so we're expecting to hear really a fresh blast of ideas here coming from Canada, and our friend Peter McLeod from the WageMark Foundation.
I think you meant to say an Arctic blast of something from Canada. I mean, I'm inclined to say, that was excellent. So just what she said, but more and faster, right? And I can't say what a pleasure it is to be in a room with people who I can assume are friends, because how many among us would want to begin a Monday morning with a rousing discussion of income inequality? So it's nice to be able to travel to Washington and meet all of you, because, of course, we tend to be a little bit more plugged in to the kind of political currents in America than perhaps you are to the political currents in Ottawa. Fair enough. Right? And so this is obviously an issue, a fight that really needs to be won here. And I very much regard our quite modest efforts in Canada as really being a bit of an experiment that we hope can be transferred not only to the U.S., but to other special distinguished jurisdictions like the UK, that are unfortunately world leaders in the production of inequality. I began WageMark officially as a foundation this summer in Toronto. I'll give you a little bit of the backstory and, of course, the rationale. You'll recall in 2010, a British researcher named Richard Wilkinson put out a book with a title that doesn't quite work for North American ears, because nobody knows what a spirit level is. But the spirit level, of course, is British for carpenter's level, and it's all about the effects of inequality as measured across OECD countries. And because he's an epidemiologist, he was particularly interested in the correlation between the degree of inequality and there being a relationship to all of those things we want more of in society and all of those things that we probably want less of in society. And I invited Richard to come to Canada to kind of do his first big tour. And I took brutal advantage of his ignorance of Canadian geography, because I told him we could do Ottawa, Toronto, and Vancouver in 2 days. Nevertheless, we got to spend some quality time in airports and on airplanes. And the reception was really surprising. We were able to get him in front of all of the provincial deputy ministers who run our departments, and half of the federal deputies. It was interesting that the head of our security services chose to come to this meeting. And I spoke with Dick Fadden after, and he said, well, obviously I'm here because inequality, of course, is a major threat to national security. And then we went out to BC and we spoke with others. But the conversation, I think, for Wilkinson and anyone else who has spent so much time thinking about these issues and how we can try and unwind a problem that is at least 30 or 40 years in the making, is to think, well, all right, how much latitude will there really be within government to affect change? And so what are some of the other tools we could reach for? And I forget which of us sort of coined this phrase, but we said, okay, so we've got dolphin-friendly tuna and forest-friendly paper. Why isn't there some kind of consumer mark around wage-responsible business? And it's a very simple idea, of course, because we've seen the effect of fair trade. We've seen the effect of, and I mean, you can pick holes in all of this, right? I mean, I think one of the secrets is not to let perfection be the enemy of the good, because there's sure a lot of good that needs to get done. The LEED standard, right, around green architecture. I noted as we were walking down 16th here this morning, and we went by the National Education Association, lo and behold, it had stamped next to its door a big Energy Star plaque, right? And who would think to put an insignia like that on the front doors of an association that has nothing to do with energy, that has nothing to do, right? But nevertheless, these things do become important. And so WageMark, quite simply, is a voluntary standard that public sector, private sector organizations can adopt to show that they are wage responsible. And that kicked off a huge debate as to, well, what constitutes wage responsible business? And so I relied on almost a dozen labor economists, political scientists, business leaders, labor leaders, to try and come up with what is admittedly an aggressive standard of just 8 to 1. We looked at the history of businesses that have used wage ratios. You've mentioned a number of them, but they tend to fall in sort of 3 camps, those that are especially utopian and kind of fall in a kind of 3 or 4 or 5 to 1 zone. And then the others like Ben and Jerry's, who sort of span between 7 and up to 12. And then there's the kind of Drucker and J.P. Morgan school around 20. And, you know, we've started with 8 to 1. I'm not sure we're actually going to stay there. We thought be interesting to begin, in part because it's very good at sparking a debate. 300 to 1 seems pretty outrageous, and people might think 8 to 1 seems equally outrageous, but we're happy to be outrageous in a different way. And if we can meet even in the middle, or maybe a bit closer to our end, we'll be happy. And so WageMark has its certification standard for those who want to be conspicuously responsible, but we've also just created a registry. And the registry is there for any organization that wants to disclose its pay ratio, again, using a standard measure. Now, we look at total compensation because, of course, most workers don't have elaborate compensation packages. They have salary and benefits. And I think, to be fair, we ought to do the same when we're looking at executive comp. We also don't look at the median. And this puts us slightly out of step with what is the kind of growing trend, not only endorsed, of course, by the SEC, but also by the Hutton Fair Pay Commission in Britain. The difficulty when you look at a median is that it doesn't entirely capture the degree of inequality within an organization of varying sizes, of course, too. So what we look at is the average of the bottom decile. So it's not the lowest paid worker, but we take that bottom 10% and we find the average amongst those workers. And then we find the ratio between that and the top. Our hope is, over the next year, that we're going to be able to push this into public sector procurement practices. And we were having a nice conversation earlier. The idea being that surely we can find a few liberal municipalities in Maryland or California or British Columbia or someplace that will, in a very discreet fashion, just slip this into a budget resolution or something, that businesses that do business with that city need to be WageMark registered, not certified. They just need to register. And, you know, I think if we are going to get a hold of this problem, we need to be working from all directions, right? So it's very important that we focus on publicly traded companies, but of course they represent, 3% of all incorporated businesses or something like that. It's quite a small number. There are so many more privately held businesses. And for me, this is much a cultural play as anything. You know, we have lost track over the course of the past 40 years about what a norm is, what a rule of thumb is, about the kind of appropriate proportionality between what average workers ought to take home and the boss. And so much of WageMark is just reintroducing a norm. It's to name it, it's to create a rule of thumb. And certainly amongst that much wider tranche of businesses, they're not living a 300 to 1 world. They're probably living closer to Drucker's reality of 20 to 1 or 15 to 1. And so we're actually focused on trying to organize all of those privately held, often much smaller businesses, and let them enjoy a little bit of distinction for those responsible pay practices. So I'm as delighted when a 6 restaurant chain in Toronto or Ottawa chooses to become WageMark certified, as I will be when a large office furniture manufacturer like Herman Miller or perhaps Umbra in our case adopts WageMark. That's all good. What more can I say about what we're trying to do? I mean, we've received a ton of actually very positive press. We haven't gone for a name and shame sort of agenda. Often when I'm interviewed, that's what the media wants to talk about, is the really gross salaries at the top. How bad is it, Pete? It's really bad. It's really bad. But I don't want to be castigating people. What I want to be doing is just making this actually a very positive campaign and recognizing those, as we saw actually during the quite remarkable Swiss referendum, where 36% of the population in November voted for a national pay ratio of 12 to 1. Now, 12 to 1 is great, again, because it doesn't conform to any particular business logic. What it conforms to is a very intuitive and I think humane idea that no one should make more in a month than someone else working at the same firm makes in a year. Mm-hmm. And that just has a kind of nice logic to it. That I think strikes most people as fair. And so you had the head of Victorinox, which makes Swiss Army knives. Hard to get more iconic of Swiss business than Victorinox, in business since like 1750, versus Novartis, the pharmaceutical maker, making about 1,100 to 1. And so Victorinox, living in an 8 to 1 world, said that kind of pay practice is simply un-Swiss. So we started thinking about WageMark as it's a mark for smart business. And increasingly we're thinking about it as a way to take pride in what you pay. And I think it's hard for any business leader living in a 300 to 1 world to actually take that much pride in what they're paying themselves and what they're paying their staff. And I think in a very sunny, positive way, we can just kind of bring that point home. So I'll stop there and really looking forward to getting into a conversation with you.
Thanks, Peter. I'm wondering if you did want to mention the union that was considering incorporating this into...
That's great. Thank you.
I
So,
thought this audience might appreciate that.
Unite Here Local 75 in Toronto, which of course organizes many of our hospitality workers and has done so to great recent effect, is working on incorporating WageMark registration in its collective bargaining practices. So the idea, again, just like procurement, would be, all right, you've got a deal, but you've got to disclose, right? And these will be for both publicly and, of course, privately held companies as well. And, when you're maybe getting down to brass tacks, that doesn't seem like too much of a concession. So we want to keep coming at this from all different sides, and WageMark as a nonpartisan, independent foundation, hopefully just acts as that kind of utility, right? That can be employed.
Thank you. I thought that would be interesting to some of the labor folks in the room, but why don't we open it up now to questions, and I guess we'll just kind of turn the mic but speak loudly, and then hopefully it'll pick up.
John Cabana from IPS. Thank you both. That was great. I just wanted to pick up on your last comment that a lot of people in Switzerland might think that something is un-Swiss. And what that might mean around the world. And I'm curious what Canadian might feel like. I remember when we first started doing our
Getting silver in hockey.
Yeah.
Too soon? Too soon?
Here we're more focused on Sweden and Russia. That's where our players from Russia are from. But no, when we first started doing the CEO to worker pay studies here 20 years ago, I remember being very conscious that across Europe and in Japan was another interesting place, it was unheard of that the CEO was paid more than, say, 30 to 40 times what the average worker was. Whereas here it was celebrated, as you pointed out, and Benita too, at different times. Wow, that guy made 1,200 times. And I'm curious, just if I know as Canada now. We used to look up to your government in Canada.
We're working on that.
But whether you feel that cultural, see, in the U.S. it feels like the culture is moving in the right direction, but it would still be hard to say what something being un-American would feel like in terms of a ratio. And I'm curious just how you're feeling that in Canada, as well as how you think it's going in Europe and in Asia.
That's a great question and an important point. I would refer you all to a great article actually from Fortune magazine from the 1950s that I've shared with Sam that I just love. And it's the story, I think it's 1955, it's the story of a successful American businessman today. And we're going to take a look at his home life. And so it goes to this kind of charming post-war suburban bungalow, right? And he has 2 cars and takes a nice vacation, and his wife, who stays at home, has a little bit of help, right? And it's actually a kind of lifestyle that most of us would be able to perhaps admire but still relate to. And that was considered sort of the image of success. And I think most people would accept that, right? So, of course, this is working across jurisdictions, but it's definitely working across time. I was in Copenhagen this summer, and a friend of mine knew the business editor at Politiken, which is their major national paper. And he said, well, go talk to, I'm sure his name was Jens or something, go talk to Jens at Politiken and see what they have to say about this. So I thought, all right. Lo and behold, WageMark then debuts the next day on the front page of Politiken and kicks off a 3-day national debate about wage ratios, where everyone from CIPOS, their conservative think tank, thinks this is a bold but not entirely unrealistic idea. The head of IKEA Denmark weighs in and says, we can't go that far, but again, it's a proposal worthy of study. Basically, their equivalents in North America wouldn't touch this debate in the same way with a 10-foot pole. So it is highly cultural. I spoke to some Norwegian friends, and they said, 8 to 1. That's quite a lot, don't you think? So I guess what you see depends on where you stand, and absolutely. The wage ratios in Japan and Northern Europe, especially in Germany, have traditionally been much lower. And of course in Germany is interesting because you have all those Mittelstand companies that are typically still privately held by families. And in family-held businesses, there does seem to be, of course, a greater empathy or appreciation for the connection between those workers and the founding family itself. The nice rejoinder that this gives you is the ability to say, when someone challenges you and wants to believe that you're paying for talent, is the fact that Northern European and Japanese economies are not exactly slouches when it comes to innovation and productivity and world-beating enterprises, and they manage to do it just fine. As for Canada, we stand at about 170 to 1, so we're a little bit more modest, as we are in most things compared to the U.S., but it's moving in the wrong direction.
Mark, did you hand up back there?
Yes, I did. I wanted to follow up on that Stanford study. where you mentioned that the CEO's pay goes up by 64%, drives up the secondary executive's pay by 26%, which leads me to wonder what was going on down at the bottom in that company, or those companies.
I don't think Charles O'Reilly studied all the way down, but his idea was that if you have CEO pay out of whack, then it's also going to percolate down to the other high levels of executives, which of course is bad for shareholders because it's not just one person whose pay is out of whack, but many people. And if you're interested, well, I could see if I can find a link or something to that.
Jim?
Jim Lardner from Americans for Financial Reform. I just wondered if you know of anybody who is moving us towards a time when it will be possible to look at an SKU on a product or input the name of a company wherever one is traveling with a cell phone or what have you, and get this information and presumably some other socially responsible metrics about the company or about the way the particular product was made.
Well, there are some efforts afoot to just amass larger and larger databases that include pay ratio data. So it's not the companies choosing to register or necessarily agreeing that that's the appropriate number. Tying that to an app or an SKU is probably the next logical step.
I have a quick question. I've been studying kind of the new economy trends and stuff, meaning a transition from worker or businesses that are based on employee owner to more employee ownership, so cooperative type of thing. So I'm wondering if there has been any studies looking at the pay ratio within cooperatives. I know the AFL-CIO and a lot of other unions, the steel workers, are kind of moving into that direction of transitioning big, large corporations into worker ownership models. So I'm wondering if the ratio, the pay-wage ratio there decreases, or if you actually have begun to look into that.
We haven't. But the idea of employee ownership is somewhat controversial. I would say there's a vehicle, financial ownership vehicle known as the ESOP, Employee Stock Ownership Plan. And a lot of companies, especially starting in the 80s, started using ESOPs because of several tax advantages, but also it would put a lot of their stock in friendly hands. And this was at a time when merger and acquisition activity was frenetic. So companies like Procter & Gamble, people may not even remember Polaroid Corporation. I mean, there were several companies that did that. United Airlines did that, but it didn't protect the employees because United Airlines went into bankruptcy not once, but several times. So it doesn't always work, not in the context of a publicly traded company.
I'm sure these studies exist. I'd recommend to you a book by Will Davies out of the British think tank Demos, and the name of the book is escaping me, but if you plugged in kind of companies ratio, Will Davies and Demos, you're sure to get something good. Anecdotally, of course, cooperatives are just frankly much more comfortable talking about how they pay people. So Mondragon in Spain, with its 80,000 employees, has, I believe, maintained a 20-to-1 or better ratio through much of the past 30 or 40 years. The point about ESOPs, I think, is interesting. In the UK, there's been a major push under Cameron, of all people, to try and facilitate the conversion of privately held firms to employee-owned firms. And part of that is a really interesting generational opportunity, and one that I'm interested in as far as Canada goes as well. It's because boomers who started businesses are trying to exit and retire, but they don't necessarily have anyone to buy their firm of 20 or 30 or 100 people. The difficulty is it's very the difficulties is difficult. The challenge is it's very difficult for employees to then obtain the capital that would be required to buy out that founder. And so in Britain, they've established a kind of revolving public fund that these employee groups can apply to and not only receive the access to capital, but also access to professional services, namely legal services that are required to assist in that transition. And I don't have the most recent numbers, but it is becoming quite a going concern. And I think that represents a world of interesting possibilities because, I mean, you can convert kind of a big swath of different bits of the economy all in the period of maybe 10 or 20 years.
Yeah, in the private sector context, it's a different story. But in the public, in publicly traded companies, the use of company stock has become controversial after Enron, and the company used to match the 401k in company stock. And so when Enron blew up, a lot of employees lost everything because their retirement money was largely invested in company stock.
Yeah, hi, Karen Dolan, IPS. I had actually 3 quick questions. I loved that historical analysis that you gave. It was so fascinating. Did I get it right when you said that in 2000 the ratio was 925 to 1?
525.
525. Okay, and then it dipped in the recession and it's only risen, and it's risen back up to 354.
That was for 2012. When we release our numbers for 2013 on Executive Pay Watch in mid-April, we'll know what it is.
Okay, all right, so I had that number wrong because it seemed like such a big dip to me. And Peter, I had 2 questions. One sort of about the whole cultural difference between Canada and some of the European countries and then the U.S. and your presentation that you don't name and shame. That naming and shaming seems to work pretty well in the U.S. We certainly do it. I think it's a culture. There is a cultural difference there, and I think that through naming and shaming, we've gotten a lot more public support on our side. And I just wondered if you had some comments on that, or maybe Sarah did. And finally, if you have the wage, if companies register with the wage mark and gets the wage mark brand, is there something that goes with it? Is there,
Glory.
So it's purely a moral motivation to profit-driven companies, in other words.
Well, insofar as any voluntary certification mark, right? I mean, it just conveys membership or adherence to a set of standards, whether they happen to be environmental or, in this case, fiscal. What we want to see happen, of course, is when there are 1,000 of the first 1,000, and then 10,000, and then however many thousand businesses that choose to belong, then you've got a membership, right? Then you can have an annual convention. The whole business model of WageMark, which is a $200 a year registration fee, is that should then kick off enough money to fund the IPS to do a study or a university group. And our intent isn't to create in-house research capacity, it's to sort of seed the clouds everywhere to keep the conversation going. And we can imagine that hopefully a number of our members will be so persuaded by this mission that they'll also be contributors above that registration fee to see this advance. But I mean, strictly speaking, they will use it in different ways. Some may choose to put it next to the kind of FSC paper mark on their product. I'm more interested in it simply being listed in their annual report, right? Or on their website. Again, it's not about being so flashy. This may matter as much simply within the company that it's known to be WageMark registered or certified, or to the board of directors, right? Than it is a public-facing mark. But we're experimenting with all of this and trying to figure it out.
I have a quick question,
Yeah,
Peter.
please.
So what's the difference between being WageMark registered and
right.
WageMark certified?
Yep.
And does it mean that they have to disclose what the ratio is?
So in both instances, they have to disclose what the ratio is. Certified is a slightly more onerous process, and it means that you're best in class, that you meet an 8-to-1 or better ratio. And to be registered is to be ratio agnostic. You could be a 200-to-1 company and still be WageMark registered. But our argument there is that simply pushing that into the public domain is a good.
Because it would be disclosed.
Because it would be disclosed.
I'll just respond to
Please,
Karen by saying I just think there's different roles for different players, and we love to name and shame here, but there needs to be carrots and sticks, and he's got the carrot and we've got the stick, and there's a lot of fun ways to work together. Amira?
Well, thank you, all three of you, for your leadership, for your tenacity on this issue. I guess I'm just wondering, in terms of the WageMark, either the certification or all your various levels, what happens with supply chains? What happens with subsidiaries? I guess, to what extent?
Yeah.
I guess
Perfect point. And I mean, you go down the rabbit hole very quickly on this. And in our certification licensing agreement, right now we can't follow the supply chain, right? And our sort of, but we do say that, you know, if you have compensation practices outside of the company, right, but are directly connected to the business of the company that are contrary to the spirit of WageMark, right, like not cool. Nevertheless, that gets fuzzy. And would we recognize or certify an organization that does? This actually came up this week, and it prompted a big op-ed in the Toronto Star that ran yesterday within the public sector. So here's the quick sketch, because I think it'll illustrate your point nicely. We organize our publicly funded health system through 14 regions in the province, and the pay ratio within these basically contracting organizations is pretty low, but the executive salaries are conspicuously high, right? And so there was some protest about that. Now, if they were, WageMark wouldn't help them because they contract out all of the home care that they do to workers who are making about $12 an hour, and that's no good, right? So in this op-ed, we said, you know, the only appropriate thing to do would be to extend WageMark to those contracted services as well. And we're going to be taking that really on a case-by-case basis. There's got to just be some good sense involved in this, and we have that discretion because we're a voluntary and independent organization. We don't need to sort of finely specify to the sort of nth detail every situation. My hope is that if someone was to start touting their ratio, and it's obvious to everyone that they've offshored a ton of their work, and that there's a huge disparity, that the simple hypocrisy of that situation would be enough to force a conversation. We do use purchasing power parity for international companies as a way of trying to understand what the ratio would be across jurisdictions.
I'm really interested in WageMark. I think it's a fantastic initiative, and I love the idea of the act that was raised here. One question I have for you is whether it has caught on as an investment criteria for ESG investment, because I think the G in ESG, which stands for corporate governance, or governance, is probably the hardest for most people to understand what it means. And it just seems like you're offering a simple way to ascertain whether a company engages in one aspect of good corporate governance.
That's very much our hope, and you know, I'd like let a 1,000 flowers bloom here around this stuff. You know, WageMark is not a solution in and of itself. We need living wage. We need commitment to progressive taxation. We need governance reform. We need B Corp, right? Our thinking was, if you could choose just one standard that you think could be a proxy for a whole lot of other behaviors in that company, would probably be the wage ratio. And we're definitely keen to see the ethical investment community take that as a measure. We had a very good meeting with a group called Sustainalytics in the past few weeks that publishes sustainability data on international companies, and they're interested in incorporating our standard as one of their measures when they produce their performance reports. So none of this is going to be happen overnight, but we think it's an adaptive enough measure that we can just push from a lot of different directions. I do want to make the point, though I'm not sure if anyone saw it 2 weeks ago in the New York Times, this just absolutely atrocious piece done in high New York Times style called "The New Domestics." Did anyone see this article? It was outrageous. It basically follows up on Tyler Cowen's thesis around average is over, and if you need to steer your sons and daughters into a growing part of the economy, it really ought to be the new servant class that is going to be managing the estates of the newly extremely ultra wealthy. So they ran like a 3,000 one. No, they ran it's actually serious. And this is the part of ratios that and the part of these 300 to 1 business that we don't think about, is the generational wealth that is just being built up and deposited, and the massive, massive skewing effects in our economy overall. So they had a series of glowing, buzzy profiles of people with graduate degrees making $200,000 or more a year to manage the households, right, of these multimillionaires, because there is a staff of 60 and it's got overhead of several $1 million a year, and so it's virtually a small business that they're running, and that they need talent to manage these private concerns and great benefit plans, and everything was rosy. Like that to me is the like we're fighting this issue as though it's a problem of today, when in fact it's a problem of tomorrow, right? In a much bigger way, actually, than it is for us right now. So every day that goes by that we don't manage to get a handle on this thing is one where we're just producing all of these offset generational effects that will take decades to unwind, right? And Sam is such an expert on how it was unwound once before, and the many different initiatives and mechanisms that were required to break up that concentration of wealth. But that's ultimately what this will have to be about.
I'll get to Betsy in just a second. I just wanted to make sure that we threw out another strategy that some folks are pursuing. We actually tried to get a speaker on this panel from National Nurses United, because one of their locals in Massachusetts got an initiative on the ballot for November to cap CEO pay at public hospitals at no more than 25 to 1. And I think that's a really fascinating new angle on this at the local level, to try to use ballot initiatives or local municipal types of actions to try to narrow the CEO pay divide. But Betsy, go ahead.
Yeah, I'm really interested in the different rationales for narrowing the wage ratio. So like the idea that Nita was talking about, that this is better for business, that it's better for worker productivity, worker morale, but also the kind of moral and ethical vision behind it. So I just wondered, like, I found it striking that you mentioned like dolphin-friendly tuna and forest-friendly paper, and like fair trade coffee. And I know that those movements often, cite studies that consumers are more likely to do business, if they know that this is an ethical, there's a 2002 Harvard study, I believe, that I see cited all the time that showed that consumers are, this number of times more likely to do business if they know this is an ethical, or a business that's associated with some ethical, ethically responsible behavior. So I just wanted to hear more about like how you saw the wage ratio as something that fits into that sort of ethical vision.
It's funny, we were in a coffee shop this morning, and what a change it's been since they started putting the calorie count next to things. And I point that out because, I mean, my God, did you know there were 400 calories in a muffin? That's such an innocent thing as a muffin. And I didn't have a muffin this morning. And I say that, you know, somewhat comically, just to show how, in fact, susceptible I think we are to information, right? And so no surprise that it does and can influence consumer choices in powerful ways. A major study was done on public attitudes to wage ratios in the UK, and Brits thought that an appropriate maximum ratio in private business was probably on the order of 6 to 1. Most people felt that they could justify their boss making 6 times what they made. And you know, I mentioned the sort of 12 to 1 and can't make more in a month than someone makes in a year and all of this. But the other thing is to what someone makes in a lifetime. So even in a 10 to 1 world, that'd be a very beautiful place. That means that the boss makes in less time than it takes to finish a college degree what you'll make in your working life. And you say that, and you're like, can that person possibly create that much value? Well, I don't know. Plato, going way, way back, thought it should be 4 to 1, right? Now that's not the sort of thing that's going to convince Stephen Colbert. I'm sure he'd have some fun with it. But this is an old discussion about fundamentally what someone's worth. And that's why in conversation with Sam last night, you know, I see this connected, and it's why it's such a treat to be in as venerable a place as the IPS, that it is actually a civil rights issue, because it is fundamentally, we keep talking about inequality, but I'm not sure that we've always, like, we're talking about equality, right? And so the history of the 20th century has been trying to chip away at all of these very conspicuous forms of inequality that separates us. We don't like to talk about what we each make, owe, and spend. There is such a taboo about talking about wages. And overcoming that, you know, we all have to kind of get out of the closet, I guess, in terms of what we're making and what we're paying. And only when we feel comfortable enough talking about this openly do I think we'll actually be able to get some traction. But this is a rights issue, right, as much as anything.
I wonder if we could talk a little bit about board directors. Consumers might be appalled if a company is producing forest unfriendly paper and so forth, but when it comes, and we cannot buy the products, but when it comes to pay, it is these directors who are setting it. I wonder if you see a path through that fortress.
But absolutely. The problem with the board of directors is that in theory, the board of directors is supposed to be looking out for shareholders' best interests. But in reality, and Riley was one of the people who did a study on this, that the members of the board are often best buddies with the CEO. They're often CEOs themselves or former CEOs. And some years ago, my colleague Pat and I looked at companies where there were 2 or more CEOs on a board and looked at performance, and there was we saw some relationship. So we filed proposals at companies that did not have more than 2 CEOs on the board. Of course, that went over really well, and the companies fought back on that. So that is the problem. There is an effort now through a consortium of women's groups, of public pension funds, labor groups called 2020 to push for diversity on the board, because a lot of boards are what are called pale, male, and stale. They're white guys, all good, friends who don't want to get off the board. So our hope is that by getting diversity, by getting women, people of color on the board, we'll be able to kick off some of these CEOs. And studies have shown that boards that are more diverse tend to be related with better performance. So absolutely.
Go ahead.
Hi, Derek Worthus from CPW Investment Group. WageMark seems like a pretty brilliant break to the ideological stalemate that is when a company takes on the defense that we just pay what the market dictates, because you're changing the way the market is framed. So two quick questions for you. First, what kind of demographic trends and what is your branding, and how do you propose this value add to a company? And secondly, what kind of moves are you making to ensure that your brand isn't co-opted by somebody else and used in a way that you wouldn't like, or somebody makes a copy in a way that's not as useful?
Well, I look forward to that problem. That's a great problem
I'm
to have.
thinking in terms of like the COC gets their version and is able to
amazing. Fantastic, yeah, co-opted, because then we got someone else at the table who we can then interrogate and say, well, your standard is actually failing to do X, Y, and Z. That's okay, right? I mean, our brand, in a sunny Canadian way, is positive. It's about taking pride in what you pay. It's making a mark for smart business. You can check out our website. I hope you will, wagemark.org. You'll see a little 45-second trailer that has it's a very kind of sunny piece about this, and just talks about how, like teams work better, and all of the traditional ways in which we try and recognize performance don't do a particularly great job, and we've tried to put a really contemporary face on this, but you can tell me whether it's any good or not. I point out too, though, that this begins at home. Some of the most reluctant would-be allies, I guess, in Canada have actually been nonprofits. And nonprofits, this is a great illustration of why this is a cultural phenomenon. So nonprofits have spent a long time trying to raise the salaries of their executive directors, in part so that, obviously, they're not earning vast multiples, but to recognize their own professionalism, to recognize that they have some stature, right? And that's in response to the example set by the private sector, right? So we've been trying to nudge, very large, well-intentioned, community-oriented organizations to disclose this, and they'd really rather not. So what that means is that, any of us who are comfortable with the notion need to just start talking about what we make. You need to put a wage mark or some other ratio conspicuously on your website. You need to put it on your business card. You need to use it like any other mark that you might, and just normalize that. And I think the kind of subtle peer pressure, right, of showing that you can talk about this and be relaxed about it and are doing something constructive about it, it can actually have a powerful effect.
John, are you volunteering to
First
register
of all,
IPS?
We have a steep 2.2 ratio.
Welcome aboard.
But yes, it's a great idea to put it on the website and to encourage other people to do it. No, I think this is fabulous. I do think, you said something at the beginning where you said it's interesting there's certain companies and I guess nonprofits in that 1 to 7 to 1 ratio, and then 7 to 12, and then above. I could imagine here in the U.S. a kind of ranking where you can be as good as J.P. Morgan. Sam was the one who sort of popularized with us the J.P. Morgan thing, and I think that would have currency here. I could imagine a bunch of companies coming to that level who wouldn't yet make it to the Peter McLeod 8 to 1. But I just wanted to ask you three, and also friends here at Change to Win in the AFL and Public Citizen and so on here, for this year, 2014, you've laid out, Vanita, you left us with two things. You want us to yell at the SEC and make sure this thing works, the disclosure thing, and you also encouraged us to give some push to the Senate legislation that would get rid of the deductibility of pay, CEO pay over $1 million. I'm curious whether any of you think we could win something else this year in addition to the CEO pay. And I think our philosophy here at IPS is there will be an increase in the minimum wage in many cities and states, and we hope federally this year. But we will feel disappointed if we don't win one or two things to pull the top down. We even have the sense, and I'm curious your feeling about this, that the sort of 1%ers and CEOs out there are sort of looking at the world as the GAP announcement kind of suggested and saying, well, there's this enormous populist pressure in this country. So either the bottom comes up or, God forbid, the top comes down. So we get it that the bottom is going to have to come up some, but we will, we are going to. So can we break through that? And I guess specifically I'd ask you about a better New York Times op-ed, like a week after President Obama announced in his State of the Union that he was going to use an executive order to pull up the minimum wage of federal contractor workers. And this guy, who Sam will remember the name, a professor suggested that he could do the same thing on the top and mandate a 25 or 20 to 1 ratio for CEOs of companies that are federal contractors. Is that a winner? Is there something else to sort of help steer the populist anger in the country towards a winnable, in addition to the SEC, top, bringing the top down?
Well, one thing to keep in mind is the 2014 is an election year. And so we have midterm elections this year. The Republicans are determined not to give Obama and the administration anything that they can use as having accomplished in 2014. And we are, I think the Republicans are holding out because there is some concern that the Senate could change hands. So I am going to say I'm very cautious about what we can accomplish in this year, but there's an even greater pressure to get whatever we can done this year because who knows what will happen in next year. There has been legislation introduced in the House a couple of times to repeal provisions of Dodd-Frank, including 953B, and one strategy might be of the business groups to pressure the SEC to delay issuing the final rule on this until there's enough of Republicans in Congress so that they can actually repeal it. That was the strategy they used with SOX 404, Section 404 of the Sarbanes-Oxley, to not implement it for smaller companies, and then finally they were able to just get rid of it. So.
I mean, I would say a couple of things. Sarah, as you pointed out in the 20th anniversary of executive access, France has its 20 to 1, I believe, or 25 to 1 requirement amongst those businesses that the French state invests or supports, of which in France there are many. And so that has immediate effect. Whether you could pursue anything like that here would be interesting. But I think your best bet is actually with municipalities because, look, they're the ones where we've all been struggling to do anything on climate change. For instance, have adopted CO2 standards and many other environmental and social sustainability initiatives. So start there and kind of build up. And that certainly means committing yourself to a longer, adventure. But so it goes. The other thing too, and about the minimum wage, so that's important, but we're always talking about proportionality, right? We're talking about relative wealth, and this is why my interest in this really stems from Wilkinson and a public health concern, because we need to regard income inequality as a kind of generalized social pollutant. So even we can't possibly do enough to bring the bottom up when the top is kind of skyrocketing away. And so long as that wide gap is there, even as folks are able to buy more goods at Costco or wherever else it might be, it's still incredibly corrosive to the body politic, right? And that's where, there's some great stuff coming down the pipe, new books and reports that'll be coming out about the connection of inequality and it's the degree to which it threatens, of course, viability of democratic governance. Sarah.
Yeah, why don't we wrap up here on this positive note. I'll just reiterate that I think going with these local strategies like the ones that I mentioned the nurses pursuing in Massachusetts, like with the minimum wage, we're seeing the momentum really building from the state and city campaigns to push on the federal government. And what I think is so brilliant about their initiative, too, is it's focusing on CEOs of public hospitals, and it's making people start to think about how CEO pay is my issue because some of my money is going to line the pockets of these guys. So the more that we can get that into people's heads, it's not just about being jealous of these people, envious of their big houses. It's about where my taxpayer money is going. I think that is a huge winner and maybe could eventually lead to the kind of procurement reforms using the power of the public purse to rein in CEO pay. I still think there's some other things that we should be able to win at the federal level, like getting rid of the carried interest loophole that gives hedge fund managers a break on their income taxes, and also eliminating the subsidies for the performance pay. But I'm really excited about the local initiatives too and things bubbling up that way. So thank you all for coming, and feel free to hang around and chat a little bit more.
Thank you.